Libertarianism is pro-immigration, pro-market, pro-trade.
More competitive, less centralized. Not military confrontations, but peaceful interaction.
The war on drugs has been actually an unmitigated disaster. The only other banned buyers for mental reasons are those committed to a mental institution by court order. So that excludes persons who commit themselves voluntarily, and it even excludes persons who are just admitted to mental institutions for observation. President Obama actually wanted to include persons who are ordered to get outpatient treatment. And that seems like a reasonable idea to me, as long as there's a process to restore gun rights when the person is no longer deemed to be a public safety risk. Now, the bigger problem, of course, with the NICS system is that the states are not required, and many do not, provide mental health data to the system. The Supreme Court has ruled that the federal government cannot compel compliance. So after these incidents like occurred at Parkland, it's possible that the states will begin to be somewhat more cooperative, and that would be a good thing. A more effective option, of course, is the earlier detection and treatment of mental illness. So I'm not an expert in that area, and I can't offer specific recommendations. I do make the obvious point that the greater scrutiny of medical records that would be necessary to detect these conditions early raises some serious civil liberties concerns, and we have to address those concerns regarding violation of privacy rights. The NRA, I'm sure you know, recommends a totally different approach, and that is to have armed guards or even to armed teachers at the schools. So it's true that I think that gun-free schools have been a magnet for the mentally unbalanced, and that maybe that's why roughly 28% now of public schools already employ security officers who carry firearms. I don't think it's a bad idea at all. We have armed guards in banks, airports, and airplanes, and power plants, and courts, stadiums, and government office buildings. So there's no reason why armed persons can't be in all public schools, not just 28% of them. And some of those armed persons could be teachers. I don't think any teacher would be required to undergo training, but those who volunteered would be given extensive background screening, psychological testing, followed by some classroom and some practical training, roughly equivalent to what sky marshals now receive. The teachers wouldn't have to carry firearms, but the weapons would be accessible to them, subject to some safe storage regulations. Well-trained teachers, some of whom may already have military experience, would materially lower the cost of armed protection. Best of all options, it hasn't gotten very much public attention, even though it would radically reduce gun violence, and that is legalize drugs. There are 1.5 million drug arrests each year, more drug inmates than for all violent crimes combined, 50% of the federal prison population. And because drugs are illegal, participants in the drug trade can't go to court to settle their disputes. So how do they settle them? By force on the streets with guns. Criminals and terrorists are earning $40 billion a year in the drug trade. And the DEA has about 10,000 agents and support staff who could be fighting real crime or terrorism. The courts are clogged, the jails are overcrowded, police are overburdened, public defenders are overworked, and racial discrimination is endemic. So we are making some progress in this area with state decriminalization of marijuana. I don't think it's going to be long before marijuana companies are publicly traded on the exchange, and the betting is that most investors will be able to buy high and sell high. The war on drugs has been actually an unmitigated disaster, and one of its pernicious byproducts has been rampant gun violence in the inner cities. So legalization really ought to be a no-brainer. So what's next? Where do we go from here? Last month, as you know, Florida approved a bill that has some useful provisions. It budgets millions of dollars to improve school security, train and arm school employees. It bans bump stocks, which convert semi-automatic weapons into illegal automatic weapons. It gives the state new powers to remove guns and ammunition from people who are deemed to be a threat to themselves or to others. And it imposes a 3-day waiting period for most long gun purchases. The bill also raises the minimum wage for buying those weapons, long guns, to 21. Now, this may not resonate with this crowd, but I think that makes sense. It is puzzling to me, however, why state lawmakers doubt that an 18-year-old is sufficiently mature to own a rifle, but he is sufficiently mature to drink, to smoke, to sign contracts, to get married, to get divorced, to have abortions, even decide by voting who it is that's going to run the country. So 21 might be the right age for rifles, but if it is, it's probably the right age for voting too. Although that would, as you know, require repealing the 26th Amendment. The NRA has sued to overturn Florida's higher age limit for rifles. My bet the NRA loses. Federal law already says you have to be 21 to buy a handgun, even though you can get a long gun, a rifle, at age 18. And in 2013, that's just 5 years ago, a U.S. Court of Appeals upheld that limit, 21 for handguns, against an NRA challenge, and the Supreme Court refused to intervene in that case. So I do think the NRA is going to likely lose that suit, but even if Florida's new law setting the rifle limit at 21 is upheld, I have to say it's just feel-good legislation. And I expect it's going to have little or no practical effect. And it's interesting to note what the FBI says about gun violence for a recent year. About 13,000 people murdered with a weapon. Of those, 1,700 killed with knives, 500 with hammers, bats, and clubs, 720 by someone's bare hands. Only 320 were killed by rifles of all types, not just semi-automatics. So before we embark on this crusade for more gun controls, we should remember a few facts. First, these random multi-victim killings are a fraction of 1% of all the murders in the United States. And sadly, they will occur even where strict gun regulations are imposed. There were 17 people murdered in Parkland, Florida. There are 17 people murdered in downtown Chicago every 2 weeks. The second thing to note is that exhaustive studies on gun control were conducted by the National Academy of Sciences and the Centers for Disease Control, neither of which is a tool of the NRA. In 2004, the National Academy reviewed 253 journal articles, 99 books, 43 government publications. They evaluated 80 gun control measures. Researchers could not identify a single gun control regulation that meaningfully reduced crime or suicide or accidents. In 2003, the CDC reported on ammunition limits, restrictions on purchase, waiting periods, registration, licensing, child access prevention. Conclusion, none of the laws demonstrably reduce gun violence. Another thing to note is that guns are already the most heavily regulated consumer product in the United States. Handguns are the only consumer product that cannot be purchased outside the buyer's state of residence. Gun retailers and wholesalers and manufacturers all require federal licenses, and all sales through those licensed dealers have to be pre-approved by the government. And nationwide, we have thousands of laws regulating who can own a gun, how it can be purchased, and where it can be possessed and used. So overall, I'm somewhat skeptical about the efficacy of gun regulations that are imposed mostly on persons who are not part of the problem. And more important, the Supreme Court has ruled that the Constitution secures an individual fundamental right to bear arms. And that means if gun control advocates believe that stringent gun regulations are required for public safety, it is up to the advocates of more regulations to establish two key points. First, that their proposed regulations are indeed going to make us safer, and second, that they couldn't have accomplished the same ends without truncating the rights of gun owners. And so far, in my view, the regulators have not met that burden. And we can't simply ignore the Constitution and act as though the Second Amendment didn't exist. It doesn't preclude reasonable gun regulations, but it does demand rigor from our lawmakers, and if necessary, from the courts in reviewing these gun control measures. We have core Second Amendment rights at risk, so we need to be sure that the ends justify the means. That's my story. I'm sticking to it, and thank you very much for your attention.
All right, guys, we're going to take questions now. If you're interested in asking a question, if you could come to the aisle and get in line.
You mentioned that the third leg of defining the Second Amendment is defining what the reasonable regulations would be. Are there cases that are working their way up to the Supreme Court now that you're aware of? And what are the details of those cases? When might they be heard?
Well, there are cases that have upheld a ban on so-called assault weapons and magazine capacity. That's in the state of Maryland. There are cases that have upheld the right to concealed carry, so that goes the other way in favor of gun owners, particularly if open carry is barred. So that one of those has to be available. You can't, the right to bear arms, bear means carry. So the courts have decided that there must be the right to either to conceal carry or to open carry. You can't ban both of them. The one issue that's likely is marinating right now, that's likely to wind up in the Supreme Court, is the issue of what restrictions can be imposed on concealed carry. There are a lot of states that require that the gun owner jump through a few hoops before he can justify a concealed carry permit. And the government retains some discretion as to which ones they're going to grant and which ones they're not going to grant. And those cases at the appellate court level have gone both ways. Some appellate courts have said this is too much in the way of a restriction. Washington, D.C.'s court said that, and therefore the restriction is a constructive ban. But in other circuits, they've said you can restrict concealed carry. You can make the gun owner justify the fact that he's in need of this weapon. So that we have split circuits, and that's the usual criterion by which the Supreme Court decides whether it's going to get involved.
I can just speak.
Okay.
The live stream won't pick it up unless you say it into the microphone. Everybody watching at home will be very confused.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. So there was recent information put out that the Parkland shooter did only use 10-round magazines, and that the rationale for him using those 10-round magazines was that they were easily concealable. So based on that sort of level of rationale, with that handguns are also concealable, and that means that only people of a higher age can only get handguns, what would your opinion be on for legislation for those type of magazines, because they are easier to conceal than standard magazines?
Well, as I indicated, that if you put a ban on small magazines, they can be reloaded very easily and very quickly by anyone who's bent on violence. They can be manufactured at home also very easily. You've got millions, actually I think the number is like in the hundreds, a couple hundred million of these magazines outstanding. So how do you get them off the street? It's virtually impossible to do so. And so many of the guns that are now sold that are already in existence are natively configured for anything up to 19 rounds. So I can't see a ban on anything below 20 rounds passing muster. I suspect that 20 rounds and above, you could ban that. I mean, frankly, you shouldn't need 20 rounds to defend yourself. And I don't know of any instance where anybody has used 20 rounds to defend themselves. So a ban on 20-round magazines, it seems to me the courts would certainly approve it, and I think the legislatures would be able to pass such a ban, particularly if they turned around and they gave the gun community something that the gun community wanted, like the ability to buy handguns interstate. So if there was some quid pro quo, some balancing effort, some ability to give a little and take a little, then I think that kind of legislation would get passed.
First off, I want to thank you for coming out today, sir. It means a lot. I just want to let you know that I'm actually a recent graduate of Stoneman Douglas High School, where the massacre recently happened.